The last video I posted in response to Tuxedo Bandito got me absolutely roasted in the comments. I love that you guys aren't afraid to tell me when you think I'm wrong. Let me do some active listening and see if I can address your concerns, and then maybe we can come to a more agreeable conclusion. Hopefully I address everyone's disagreements in this video. Stick around to the end. I was going to save it for another video, but instead I'm just going to discuss it in this one. My theory on the dev's plan regarding the striker backpack change. Hey agents, it's Dispatch. Welcome to the channel where we talk about the math, builds, lore, and game design of Tom Clancy's The Division 2. Let's get stuck into it. Let's dip through the arguments that we saw in the comments of the last video. The first one that I saw most was, we didn't want these changes. We just wanted new content. I saw a lot of variations of the same point, and I hear you. I see rework gear sets as new content. Most of you don't. So from now on, I'll just consider it rework content. In my How Division 2 Survives video, I talked a lot about a bunch of very efficient changes that the devs could make to give us rework content that I considered new content at the time. Things like being able to run missions backwards or with different factions, changing up spawning behavior, etc. To me, that would be enough content for me to keep playing. It seems absolutely clear that this isn't enough for everyone else. I respect that. In that video, I talked about how Descent almost immediately died and how Countdown was destined to meet the same fate. So it seemed to me that new maps and new modes cost a lot of developer time and money without a significant return. Same went for Kenley and Summit. Though I think Descent is underplayed, Countdown I think is clearly still being used a lot. I do, however, think that Countdown is only played because it's a clear loot cave. It's never been easier to put together a build. If it had been the same loot distribution as every other activity, it would fall into the same category as these other modes. So to get a read on what players would actually want, I posted a poll on the community page. It seems people want more open world spaces, missions, and maybe a new incursion or raid. I would like these as well. The incursion is a lot of fun, and I think it was a fantastic addition to the game. It bucks this trend that I saw of new game modes failing miserably. So while unfortunately we won't be getting a new incursion anytime soon, we will be getting a DLC with supposedly a new Brooklyn map and new missions. Until we get that new content, we are going to see a lot of little changes to try and keep us playing. I get that you don't want to wait and that you want new content now. That's just not in the cards. If you don't enjoy playing the game as it is, then don't play it. Wait until the DLC comes out and then decide if you want to hop back in. On these notes, it seems like the devs hear us. They're going to be giving us something that we want. New open world spaces and missions, and they're doing it as fast as they can. The DLC will be paid, so it's not like they're going to purposely drag their feet on something that could give them a huge influx of cash. They want that as soon as possible. Number 2, the devs don't respect the community. I saw this a lot too. Players seem to have a fairly negative view of the devs and or Ubisoft. I hear you. Let me make a point before we get into this. Every action that we take as people is interpreted. Interpretations are determined not just by the actions themselves, but also by context and our own bias. As a general rule, I don't trade in assigning bad intentions to people. I am very aware of and stick by my own bias that I will always interpret actions in the best possible light. Grumpy Old Man in the comments asked it very pointedly, why didn't I address the cynical points? Because I am not cynical about the game. You will see this with games a lot across the board, not even just this game. The devs don't want us to have fun, the game is dead, etc., etc. I just cannot imagine that someone is deliberately sabotaging their own work, their own job. In my opinion, I make my arguments with regards to the actions themselves rather than speculating on their intent. I don't see any point in doing this, as it can be wildly inaccurate and because I don't believe in it. There's always that easy narrative. It can fit almost any set of actions. Any mistake is leapt upon to support it. Any good action is ignored. Case in point with these changes in Seasons 2.0, the devs are changing things. Some had the interpretation that these are quote-unquote distractions. That is a negative interpretation. You could just as easily take my interpretation. The devs know that we are waiting a long time without substantive content, so they're trying to throw us a bone and give us some enjoyment in the meantime. The action is the same, but each of us chooses to interpret it differently. Now, you may not like the new or rework content. That's fine. I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't enjoy. I'm not going to expound the negative interpretations that I don't believe in for every single issue. Same goes for new gear. When it's too weak, it's decried as useless filler. When it's too strong, it's decried as forcing us to regrind. Hell, Tux's overpowered seasonal gear idea would feed right into this. If it was implemented, you'd have to grind every single season to get the best gear. That's not to say that the devs haven't screwed up and lost a lot of confidence with the community. Stability has gotten better and better on the whole, but there have still been and continue to be patches that completely bug out or break the game. As I said before, fragile armor being bugged to this day is a travesty. Meanwhile, the God rolled crafty items at the crafting bench get nuked immediately. That engenders a lot of ire from the community, rightfully so. The devs have talked a lot about balancing recently. That was one of the reasons they stated for the idea of seasonal characters, so clearly they've got some metric telling them the balance is off. But I get it. You're frustrated. And I think that frustration plays into our next point. Number 3. The general sentiment seems to be kicking us while we're down. I hear you. With the current state of the game, buggy, and probably a bit stale at least for most people, and the current state of the players being frustrated, untrusting, the timing of the changes might just not be right. Other content creators have said this as well. With the current mind state of the player base, these changes were never going to be successful. People are responding to how they feel about the nerfs. Regardless of the objective reality, once you know about the change, the feeling remains. When I addressed this in the last video, I mentioned that if content creators didn't talk about the changes, nobody would know. What I meant to say was that if the changes to Striker specifically were made without patch notes, nobody would notice, meaning that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference when actually using it. In my opinion, I've shown in my past videos that with crit variability and actual differences in HTK and TTK, that these changes, if present at all, aren't noticeable. Of course, based on what I actually said, I was wrong. People do check the patch notes, and some people check their gear before they use it, especially after a patch. I was wrong there. And once you know that a change has been made, you'll almost always feel it, whether placebo or not. And of course, with the Oreo rate of fire nerf, people would have noticed. And this is one thing that I've sort of come around on. I disagree with the rate of fire nerf on the Oreo. Having something with a high rate of fire is fun. Since you'll really feel that rate of fire nerf, it'll lessen the fun of the weapon. A damage reduction or other nerf would have been much less noticeable. With the almost reduced mag size, of course, yes, people also would have noticed that. I still believe that content creators have a lot of sway. We don't necessarily create the perception, but we do feed into it. I think maybe I came across a little too strong in the last video. I don't think that we are the end-all be-all determining players' perception. 4. Balancing in general. The balancing that I've been talking about is balancing amongst the various gear in the game, so it's all relatively on the same power. I am not talking about balance between players and enemies. Let's talk in detail about what this balance is. Balance is where items in the game, be that weapons or builds, have relatively equal power. Balance is never going to be perfect, and there are a lot of factors that determine power. 1. Ease of use. 2. Applicability. 3. Uptime. And 4. Magnitude. Ease of use is a measure of the skill floor of the item. If it's very easy to use, it becomes more powerful. Applicability refers to how many situations the item is applicable in. Basically, this is how situational an item is. If an item is situational or requires very specific conditions, it is less powerful. Uptime refers to how often, on average, the item performs optimally when the conditions are met. Magnitude is the maximum output of an item based on a metric such as damage, repairs, etc. when used at the maximum skill ceiling. All of these, as I said before, are relative to other items in the game. So let's apply this to the items in the game. Headhunter is a talent that is challenging to use as it requires a headshot, which isn't always easy to hit, especially on some factions. For applicability, it requires enemies with heads available to shoot and requires the enemy to be killed in one shot to maximize its effectiveness. For uptime, if used correctly, it can have a 100% uptime if the conditions are met. For magnitude, it provides the highest damage possible in the game. So in isolation, Headhunter is extremely powerful, balanced out slightly by its ease of use. Now, let's take it out of isolation. When items are viewed in context and intersection with other items, these other items can change any of these four balance factors. Viewing the items together is how the devs can change different aspects of the game to balance it without necessarily directly changing the items. We'll talk about this later as well when we get to Striker, because it's particularly important there. For our Headhunter example, you didn't see it dominate general use because of its ease of use. As soon as Determine was introduced to the game, however, it completely eliminated any previous balance Headhunter had, and we can see that it's used much more often than previously. We can see this trend with every weapon and talent in the game. Their magnitude is balanced out by these other factors. Even weapon types are balanced by optimal range and handling aspects, which affects their applicability. I also saw arguments that exotics should be overpowered. I absolutely disagree with this based on our definition of power. Exotics usually have an interesting talent that goes beyond normal talents in terms of magnitude, but is always balanced by these other factors. If an exotic is always overpowered and never situational, then it just becomes always the best choice, which is boring. You need to tune your build or playstyle to make use of the interesting talent that it has to increase its applicability, uptime, or ease of use. With the Chatterbox, for example, baseline, it's very weak. The base rate of fire is terrible. You need to get close and be able to reload to get the talent going, and then it feels good. You need enough survivability to be close to the enemy, but you also need enough damage to chain kill to maximize its effectiveness. It is best in situations where you can chain kill without reloading. If you're able to use it in those situations and are skilled enough to use it, it should be overpowered. It should have a large magnitude. Same goes with Chameleon. If you can get the stacks and maintain them by ending combat soon enough, it is overpowered, rightfully so. In both of these instances, with the Chatterbox and Chameleon, they aren't great at long distance, and they probably won't work on Legendary. These applicability and ease of use weaknesses bring them into balance. Now let's look at an unbalanced example, the Merciless. This weapon requires you to hit many shots on the enemy to activate its talent, the Explosion. Unfortunately, its ease of use is poor due to its terrible handling. Because it fires relatively slowly, the uptime of this damage is fairly low. As far as magnitude, it's pretty bottom tier in terms of DPS, and I don't remember the exact math on the Explosion, but I remember it being pretty mid, so let's just assume it's bad on that front as well. So its magnitude is also poor. Its applicability is fine, you can use it in most situations. Even though we can greatly increase its ease of use through a small amount of weapon handling, the other factors still hold it back and leave it overall underpowered and unbalanced. Another quick example is the Nemesis, which is second only to the TAC 50 in terms of damage, but requires a charge up. Therefore, it was balanced. We can also look at Striker. Striker used to lose stacks over time and if you missed. It lacked ease of use as it was difficult to maintain stacks. This made it pretty bad for most content, but for a boss burn or a bounty, you could absolutely make it work. It rewarded accurate fire with blistering damage, aka a high magnitude. It affected the applicability of the set because it was situational. After it got changed, it became extremely easy to use and had very little downside. Even at base, it's competitive with maxed out high-end builds, as I've shown in past videos. Both Oreo and St. Elmo's are overpowered from baseline, regardless of their talents. They have a high magnitude. Neither of these were particularly hard to use. Elmo's especially has a ton of weapon handling, making it easier to use than most ARs. Both were applicable in pretty much any content. Their magnitude had a high uptime as well because their talents didn't really affect their magnitude. Now this is where we once again get to the intersection of gear and weapons. Both of these, the Oreo and Elmo, are increased in power by Striker, since they're both effective at stacking it. That's why they became the dominating duo. There's no downside, there's no interesting or balancing talent or mechanic to deal with. They're just always the best. They need a nerf and an interesting talent change to buff it back up. Reduce their baseline magnitude and give situational or uptime related talents to buff it back up. Until then, having them nerfed to be in line with everything else is going to be good. St. Elmo's got buffed in the weapon damage department due to the M4 buff. So that means that the nerf was very minor, especially now that it got its magazine size back. You essentially lost just under one minor attribute of critical hit chance and half a minor attribute of critical hit damage. There seems to be this sentiment that any nerf is automatically putting these weapons and gear out of balance. This isn't the case, just even based on definition. These things are used because they are overpowered, so nerfing brings them into balance with other items. In that way, it doesn't force you to change your build, it simply means that it's just as powerful as everything else, so you have the choice of choosing other options without losing power. We can have a discussion on whether things are balanced or not, but just decrying nerfs because they are nerfs is a shortcut on the conversation, a judgment that doesn't comport with the facts. Let's talk about why balancing is important. Balancing is important to give players more viable choices. When things are way out of balance, things get very boring because players inherently want to use the best items. Even players who deviate from the meta will always have that feeling in the back of their head that they would have an easier time using the overpowered items. I get that this isn't completely rational. The presence of better gear doesn't necessitate that you use it. If you're getting bored with the meta, you could say, use something else. However, this is a phenomenon, whether it's rational or not, especially in group play where there is extra pressure to contribute to the group. So more balance means more choice, which means more players having fun. That means a longer lasting game. I get that people prefer buffs over nerfs. I understand that as much as this attitude isn't rational, it's roughly as rational as preferring balance because you emotionally don't want to use underpowered gear. You have to realize that nerfing one gear set is much easier by definition than buffing 16 other gear sets. Same goes for weapons and brand sets. In spite of this, the devs did buff some of the other gear sets and, rebalanced all the weapons. So I guess you guys are right. Since they're touching everything already, they might as well buff things up. They didn't buff all of them. And as a lot of you rightfully pointed out, they didn't address some of the most underpowered gear sets. These absolutely deserve buffs, and I echo your sentiments here. When you ask why they did this, you could come up with your own cynical reason. I think they did this to test whether people would try the few buff sets before they went in and changed everything. To change all the gear sets only to have players stick with Striker would feel like a waste of time. In essence, I see this as them dealing with the low-hanging fruit. Maybe some of the other gear sets they think will require more changes than just the raw numbers. You can interpret it how you want, but the baseline is that a lot of gear sets need buffs, and on this, we absolutely agree. I won't get cynical about it, but I absolutely agree with you. Now let's talk about the perception of balance. Tux talked about this in his video. The devs are more so attacking the perception of balance than the objective balance itself. Balance doesn't matter if the vast majority of players are convinced that the game is unbalanced and it's causing them to get bored. So the perception of balance is more important than the actual balance itself, though the two should be, in some sense, linked. This ties back to Elmo and Striker. Before the Elmo, the FAMAS was the highest rate of fire AR in the game, so that's what was used with Striker. Most ARs were pretty balanced in isolation, but when synergized with Striker, the FAMAS became the meta choice. Even then, there was a little bit of variety in what weapon talent you would choose on your FAMAS, and you could also use the CTAR, Police M4, etc. if you wanted, and no one would give you any grief. Many people did do this, citing better hit percentage or other differences as to why they deviated from the FAMAS. Once the Elmo and Oreo came around, however, those two began to dominate. If Striker wasn't in the game, almost every single AR would be viable. The difference between them is very small in terms of even DPS. As I've shown in the past, from an objective balance standpoint, in terms of TTK that you feel in-game, you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between different weapons, especially with the variation due to crits. Tux pointed out that even if everything is pretty balanced, it wouldn't be perfect. Therefore, the players will always gravitate towards the best one, no matter how small the difference between it and the rest of the items is. This is where perception comes in and how content creators play a role. If every content creator is saying that the FAMAS is the best by a long shot, then that's what players are probably going to use, even if objectively it loses on TTK for, say, a red enemy, the most prevalent enemy variancy in the game. An example of this is from my personal experience. I played a lot of Battlefield. I started on Battlefield 3 and played up to 2042. I am, you know it, the stereotypical close quarters fiend. I'm the guy who plays 24/7 Metro, Locker, and Redacted servers pretty much exclusively. In Battlefield 4, the meta was the AEK. However, I regularly outdueled players with the M416, even though it had lower DPS. Why is this? It had greater accuracy. Even though it wasn't the meta, it was better for me. So perception doesn't always match up with reality, especially when that reality is slightly different for every player. Giving the players the objective facts, whether that be TTK, DPS, mag damage, whatever, helps them make their own decisions. Seeing 5% DPS loss on a spreadsheet is very different and feels much different than 25%. The closer that is to 0%, the more balance and the more variety there will be in players' preferences. So it's the job of the players who know more to educate others on the objective balance of the game as much as we can to the accuracy that we can in order to make the perception line up. So let's transition. We'll talk about specific weapon balancing that has been implemented this PTS. 5. Weapon balancing. The massive wave of weapon balancing to me doesn't make too much sense. Other than the Oreo and St. Elmo's, most weapons were well balanced. The only exception to this was the dominance of Striker favoring weapons with high rate of fire and big mags like we just discussed. Honestly, I think they should leave most of the weapons as is. It makes more sense to make these changes once we know how the gear pans out in the wake of the Striker nerf. Will the ACR, for example, buffed in Project Resolve, shine with Umbra, which is finally viable and could be in widespread use? Will the AK become the new best in slot due to the buff to weapon mods taking away its poor handling? This is almost too much to be decipherable and has a confusing intersection with the changes to gear and weapon mods. So overall, I think I've changed my opinion slightly on this. I think these changes aren't good. Of course, not talking about rifles becoming automatic. That was a fantastic change. Keep that for all time. And I also agree with those of you who pointed out that Determined noticeably didn't get a nerf. I have advocated and will continue to advocate for Determined to work like Perfect Determined, where you only get one free headshot every other hit. Specifically on the Oreo nerf, I think they should leave the rate of fire at the same level and find another way to balance it. As I already said, rate of fire is very visceral and good feeling, and taking away is more impactful to the player experience than nerfing another component of it. 6. In regards to balancing player power compared to enemies. We've gotten a power creep buff through expertise. Even if you don't need the damage to complete content, other players who are on the borderline might need it. You can't reasonably argue that it doesn't make a difference. At the very least, a struggling player would be able to throw on 2 more armor cores with almost no weapon damage penalty and get a million more shield health. That's significant. We were able to do legendaries before Striker got changed, before St. Elmo's, before Oreo. I understand wanting things to be easier. Overpowered Heartbreaker was great for doing legendaries, and I took advantage of that myself. Or put it another way, I understand the feeling that legendaries are going to be harder now, and that doesn't feel good. However, there are some like Tux who seem to think that we want to feel powerful. He goes on in several videos about wanting a power fantasy. Multiplicative Division in the comments also touched on this as well. I'm going to have to side with Rogue Gold here though. Heroic content is pretty easy with an optimized build, especially in a group. Legendary isn't giving you much better loot, if any. If the power fantasy isn't enough from Heroic, play a lower difficulty. Yeah, you'll get worse loot, but let's be honest. The game has been out for 5.5 years. Do you really need more loot? The game has Countdown, which is way more efficient for getting loot than other modes. Just play that if you need loot. Play higher difficulties for the challenge and the loot. Why should the game give you a power fantasy as well? Are you really playing Legendary, the hardest difficulty in the game, expecting a power fantasy? It's the hardest difficulty. Besides, the devs gifted you a 26% weapon damage bonus, and that hasn't helped. What magical number would give you enough of a power fantasy? There are games out there like Dark Souls that are really hard. You go in knowing that it's going to be a difficult game. Same with Sid Meier's Civilization. There were like 12 difficulties. I haven't even tried half of them because they're too difficult for me, and that's completely fine. I don't know why you'd expect to feel an arbitrary level of power that you've decided in your head at the highest difficulty in the game. This also plays into complaints that the enemies are too tanky. I don't understand this. I don't know what game you've been playing for the past 5 years. More if you played the Division 1, but if you expect squishy enemies, you haven't been playing this game. I don't know what to say. I've come down on the side of thinking the tankiness of enemies is actually good. And it allows for differences in weapon types that are viable and allows us to actually experience the difference in our builds. If everything dies in 2 headshots from an AR, why would you ever run an MMR? Just as an example. I, for one, find the challenge rewarding in itself. I've been made fun of in the past for having a relatively low SHD, but even now, I have basically every gear piece that I need. I've been running solo Legendary Summit because I enjoy the challenge and trying to get better. But that's just me. So guys, I'm sorry. I don't understand. If your idea of fun is steamrolling enemies with impunity, I see no problem in you getting worse loot in order to get that experience. If you want good loot, you have to face a pretty minimal challenge to get it. Seems to make sense. Once again, though, I do understand that it doesn't feel good to have your legendary experience get harder. 7. Expertise is the root of most of these problems. As some of you pointed out, expertise does play a role in this. I think a lot of the problems are through the dev's own creation. I think a large part of the problems are the dev's own creation. And among them, expertise. It's a flawed system and always has been, as I said in a whole video about expertise. Not only is it a boring system, it incentivizes using the same weapons every time. Why would I switch to a new weapon when I've already used all my materials getting my Elmos to 26, so it's just way better. Elmos and Oreo launched clearly overpowered. Heartbreaker launched broken, and the dev misinformation or disinformation broke a lot of trust with the devs. Striker was changed to be significantly more powerful than it should have been. All of these problems were predictable. I and some others said as much. If today they took away expertise, as I would personally want to replace with my system, players would still be upset that they universally nerfed every player. But maybe that's the thing that would set things right. Take away expertise and universally give every weapon and skill a 15% multiplicative boost just across the board. Give everything a buff. Let me know if you agree with that plan in the comments. Just throwing it out there. 8. Finally, I'm going to tell you the reason behind the Striker backpack nerf, according to me. Ultimately, I think it comes down to crit. How does a backpack relate to crit? Well, it's all tied together. The devs said they want to provide more ways to play. In this instance, this seems to be they want other alternatives to crit builds. So something like stacking into weapon damage and damage to armor or damage to health might become viable in theory. This is reinforced by the weapon mod changes. Now there are very viable alternatives to critical hit chance for weapon mods. So how are they nerfing crit? Largely through crit chance. We saw reductions to Cheska and Providence and St. Elmo's. So how does this relate to Striker? Well, we have to look at Striker as a whole. Striker is lacking in crit. Until Elmo came along, you would have to sacrifice some crit damage to run crit chance. So by nerfing Elmo and Cheska, now they're trying to guarantee you'll have to make this sacrifice. But why the backpack? Well, we already talked about balance. The chest piece usually isn't viable other than in legendaries, because it's too hard to get those extra stacks. So it's balanced by its applicability. It's situational. So the chest is a bit more balanced than the backpack. The backpack now only gives you just over 15% multiplicative damage at max stacks, which is just barely better than even Composure or Companion at max stacks. So now we bring in the final piece, Coyotes. Coyotes is the easiest way to get crit and was a staple of Striker builds. So now the choice becomes use the Striker backpack, a high-end chest, and Coyotes to get enough crit, or use a better backpack with the Striker chest and Coyotes and struggle to get your stacks, or lose a lot of crit and go with a high-end backpack and chest. At the same time, Killer got a huge buff, and again, I think this is supposed to tilt your build that way as well. The buff to Killer is essentially making up for those critical hit damage minor attributes that are going to be lost to changing over to critical hit chance. Whether or not this will actually be an interesting and good way to nerf things remains to be seen. Let me know if this theory makes sense and if you agree with this path that the devs seem to be on. Alright agents, that's a lot of words. Hopefully those words were respectful and addressed some of your opinions. Some of your arguments I just couldn't get behind, and some of them you guys made excellent points. Again, with this video, we are getting super close to our 1,000 subscriber goal. Please subscribe. Thanks to everyone who commented on the last video because the response was amazing. I love it. Keep it coming. I'm hoping you guys will keep me on the right track in the comment section of this video as well. Like or dislike the video based on how you felt about it. Again, check out our playlist to see more based on what type of content you like. Thanks for debating with me, agents. Until next time, this has been Dispatch. Take care out there.